The North American A-5 Vigilante, sitting inside the National Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola, stretches 63 feet nose to tail. It dwarfs every carrier jet parked around it. And the whole airframe, every pound of titanium, every inch of that beautiful fuselage, got built around a bomb bay that never delivered a single weapon in combat. That fact alone should have killed the airplane. North American designed the A-3J Vigilante in the mid-1950s to do one job: haul a nuclear weapon at Mach 2 off a carrier deck and put it on a Soviet target. The company threw everything at the problem. They tucked two General Electric J-79 engines into the fuselage with variable geometry inlets. They gave it the first production fly-by-wire system in American aviation. They built a bomb nav computer, the AN/ASB-12, that weighed over half a ton and packed more processing power than anything flying at the time. The weapon delivery concept, though, bordered on insane. Instead of a conventional bomb bay with doors underneath, North American engineers designed a linear bomb bay running between the two engines. The nuclear store sat in a long tube, and on release, the weapon ejected rearward out the tail between the jet pipes. Two fuel tanks went with it, jettisoned in sequence to clear the store. The whole package tumbled out behind the aircraft at supersonic speed. If you flew for the Navy in the late 50s and watched that design brief, you had questions. Plenty of aviators did. Commander Don Booker, one of the early Vigilante pilots, put it plainly in a later account. The system had too many moving parts, and the stores hung up more often than anyone wanted to admit. If your dad or your uncle ever worked a carrier flight deck in those years, wrestling with machines like this one, hit subscribe and drop their rate or squadron in the comments. Give that a like. Those stories matter here. So what went wrong with the bomb bay? Aerodynamic buffeting in the ejection tunnel, fuel tank separation failures, timing glitches in the sequential release. The weapon didn't always leave the airplane when it should have, and when it did leave, it didn't always go where the ballistics said it would. Test after test at China Lake and Point Mugu turned up problems. North American kept patching. The Navy kept finding new failure modes. By 1962, the Kennedy administration had handed the strategic nuclear mission to Polaris submarines. The Vigilante lost its reason for existing before it ever flew an operational strike. 56 aircraft built as A-5A bombers. Not one dropped a nuclear weapon in anger. The fastest bomber the Navy ever launched from a carrier deck couldn't reliably drop its own bomb. And then something stranger happened. Al White punched the Vigilante past Mach 2 over Edwards Air Force Base on December 1, 1958, and felt the airframe shudder once, a single hard vibration through the seat pan and rudder pedals, before the ride went glass smooth. At that speed, the airplane stopped fighting the air and started cutting through it. North American had designed one of the cleanest supersonic shapes ever bolted onto landing gear. But clean aerodynamics don't explain why the Navy bought this thing in the first place. The answer sits in a bureaucratic knife fight most people have forgotten. In the mid-50s, the Navy faced an existential budget threat. The Air Force argued that carrier aviation couldn't deliver nuclear weapons fast enough or far enough to matter in a general war. Curtis LeMay's Strategic Air Command owned the mission with B-52s and the new B-58 Hustler. The Navy needed a response, something that could carry a nuclear weapon at Mach 2 from a flight deck and prove carriers belonged in the strategic game. The British had tried something vaguely similar with the Buccaneer, building a dedicated carrier strike platform around a single narrow mission set. Different era, different threat, different airplane entirely. But the institutional pressure looked the same. A naval air arm fighting for survival against land-based alternatives. Anyway, North American won the contract in 1956 with a design so ambitious it scared the procurement officers reviewing it. The Diane integrated navigation and attack system alone required more vacuum tubes than a destroyer's combat information center. The airframe used honeycomb sandwich panels and titanium structural members at a time when most shops couldn't reliably weld titanium. Each A-5A cost roughly $10 million in 1960 money. Adjusted for inflation, north of $95 million per copy. For comparison, An F-8 Crusader ran about 1.4 million. The Navy bought the airplane knowing full well it pushed every boundary of carrier operations. 63 feet long, 37,000 pounds empty, landing at 150 knots. Deck crews called it the Flying Cadillac. Maintenance chiefs called it worse. They built it anyway. The nuclear mission demanded it. And then, the nuclear mission evaporated. At 400 knots and 2,000 feet, the cockpit of an A-5C smelled like hot metal and sweat-soaked nylon. The vibration came up through the ejection seat rails, a constant low-frequency hum that rattled fillings and blurred the instrument panel unless you locked your helmet against the headrest. That hum meant the cameras were running. The Navy took its failed bomber and turned it into the fastest reconnaissance platform in carrier aviation. North Americans stripped the useless linear bomb bay and packed the fuselage with cameras, side-looking airborne radar, an infrared line scanner, and electronic intelligence receivers. They redesigned the wing with a leading-edge droop and added blown flaps for better low-speed handling aboard ship. The A-5C designation replaced the A-5 and gave the Vigilante a second life nobody had planned. So why did the Navy need a Mach 2 reconnaissance jet over North Vietnam? Because the RF-8 Crusader photobirds couldn't survive the Route Package 6 environment around Hanoi and Haiphong, not consistently, not at the speeds required to outrun the SA-2 guideline missiles, and the radar-directed 37 and 57 millimeter guns ringing every target worth photographing. The RA-5C could. It also couldn't jink. That detail mattered more than speed. Reconnaissance runs demanded straight and level flight over the target for the cameras to produce usable imagery. No evasive maneuvering, no hard brakes. You flew the line the photo interpreters drew on your kneeboard card, and the North Vietnamese gunners below knew exactly what that line looked like because you flew it the same way every time. Commander Bob Mandeville of RVAH-13 described flying into Route Pack 6 as watching the flak start behind you and walk forward until it found your altitude. You held course. The reconnaissance navigator in the back seat watched the infrared scanner paint the ground and called the seconds until turn point. The whole run might last 90 seconds. It felt longer. 18 RA, 5 Cs lost per 100,000 flight hours. The highest loss rate of any aircraft type in the Navy's Vietnam inventory, higher than the A-4 Skyhawk, higher than the A-6 Intruder. 27 Vigilantes shot down over the course of the war, out of roughly 140 built in the reconnaissance configuration. One detail that goes nowhere but sits in the records: at least 3 RA-5C crews were shot down twice over North Vietnam, recovered, returned to flight status, and completed their combat tours. The personnel files don't explain how the manning worked after the second shootdown. They just list the next deployment. Here is what the straight and level runs bought. Every major strike package into North Vietnam depended on pre-strike and post-strike RA, 5C photography. Bomb damage assessment came from Vigilante film canisters recovered on the flight deck. Target coordinates for the next day's alpha strikes came from Vigilante sensors processed overnight aboard ship. The intelligence pipeline ran through that airplane. No other platform carried the sensor suite. No other platform flew fast enough to survive the mission profile. The airplane the Navy almost scrapped delivered the imagery that made the air war functional. What do you call an airplane that lost more crews per flight hour than any other jet in the Navy's inventory, and still had volunteers lining up to fly it? The Vigilante community called themselves the longest line in naval aviation. Not the biggest, not the most glamorous. The longest, because every reconnaissance sortie stretched across hostile airspace in a straight line at a fixed altitude while the world shot at you. RVAH squadrons carried a gallows humor about it that outsiders found unsettling. The Navy retired the RA-5C in 1979. No replacement followed. Satellites in the RF-14 Tomcat's TARPS pod absorbed pieces of the mission, but nothing replicated the Vigilante's combination of speed, sensor coverage, and real-time tactical reconnaissance at the point of the spear. Maintenance man-hours ran north of 200 per flight hour by the end, roughly triple an F-4 Phantom. The airframe ate money. It ate spare parts. It ate careers when things went wrong on the deck or in the pattern at 150 knots. 39 crewmen killed in combat flying A-5Cs over Vietnam. Another 26 killed in operational accidents. The reconnaissance navigator sat backward in the rear cockpit with no forward visibility and limited flight controls, along for the ride in the most literal sense. During ejection sequences, the rear seat fired first. When it didn't fire at all, the pilot faced a choice that shows up in several incident reports with language so clinical it turns your stomach. The North Vietnamese gunners who tracked these aircraft knew exactly what they looked like. Long, distinctive, unmistakable against the sky at low altitude. They knew the flight profiles. They knew the Vigilante couldn't deviate. A captured North Vietnamese air defense officer told debriefers after the war that his battery considered the RA-5C the most predictable target in the American inventory. He also called the crews who flew them brave to the point of stupidity. The debrief transcript, declassified in 1981, records that comment without editorial. Commander Jim Newsom flew 2 combat cruises with RVAH-7 off the Ranger and the Kitty Hawk. Years later, he told a reunion audience that nobody in the airplane ever felt heroic. You felt the catapult shot, you flew the line, you brought the film home, and you went to the wardroom for lunch.